Let me just say, first of all, that it's really good that Sven is here. I don't know whether you realise how important Sven is.
No, I don't. I don't.
Sven is effectively the chief policy analyst and head of policy in the European Commission, an aid agency which spends 10 billion euros a year, runs our trade policy, has a big role in security interfaces and global public goods multilateralism. He is the Nick Dyer, if you know DFID, he's the Alan Winters, he's the Chris Whitty, and a number of other chief advisors all rolled into one. Nick Dyer, I think, has in policy division a staff of something like somewhere between 250 and 300. Sven has a staff currently of, I think, 3 going up to 6, is that right?
Yeah, 100% increase. Huh?
Everything you need to know about the problem we have with European development cooperation is in that number. Not in the personality or presence of Sven, who will be great in the job, but to have a policy division for an agency that size, which consists of 6 people, is kind of, I mean, I know it's more complicated than that, but it's really good. Anyway, we're very glad you're here. I think we have to have realistic expectations about where we are in terms of European development policy, and I feel very sorry in a way for Andris Piebalgs. I mean, if you compare Andrew Mitchell, came in having been Shadow Secretary of State with a manifesto. Andris Piebalgs did not have that because he was kind of appointed relatively short notice. He takes charge of a system which is undergoing radical administrative reconfiguration. He's about to lose half of DG development and a good chunk of the programming powers to Baroness Ashton running the External Action Service. But that hasn't started because they're in dispute with the Parliament about who owns it and how it's going to be managed and what the political accountability is and so on. And at the same time, Europe is in a slow growth, fiscal crisis, Euro crisis mode in which it's really hard to get anything done. So I think it would be great if Andris Piebalgs had come in and said, here I am, I've got 6 priorities for my 5 years, they are visionary, strategic and transformatory. In a bit the way that World Bank presidents do when they take over. If you think back to Bob Zelik's key first speech at the annual meetings when he became president, he was able to stand up and say, I've got 6 priorities. And in everything the bank does, you see those 6 priorities reflected over and over again. And I think Andris Piebalgs needs to get to that point because, as I'll say in a second, he has an enormously complicated operation to drive. I don't think he is there yet, but I don't think that's his fault. I think he's got some difficult challenges that he's dealing with. Now, Deborah Johnson and Michaela Gavras, who isn't here today, and I have become Kremlinologists, and I just want to say a word about the process. I think Sven has illustrated the complexity. The way this policy-making business works in the Commission, most of you know this, of course, already, better than I do, is that the Commission produces a communication, and in this case it's called the Spring Package. And here is the Spring Package. Problem 1, it consists of a summary document, which is the official communication, which is actually called the 12-point EU Action Plan in support of the MDGs. And then it has a whole series of staff working papers backing it up on different topics. There's one on policy coherence, there's one on financing for development, there's one on aid effectiveness, and there's one on the MDGs. I never understand what the status of these background documents is. Are they part of the package or are they supplements to the package? What status do they have in the discussion? This all goes to a committee of member states chaired by the presidency. Finally, it goes, as it did on Monday, was it, to the Foreign Affairs Council, which William Hague and Andrew Mitchell both attended. And here is the press release which summarises the discussions and conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Council. And exactly as Sven said, you then have to take this original document, line by line, and this set of conclusions line by line, and see what they added in, what they took out, what they agreed with. And sometimes you think this is an entirely different universe. These things have nothing to do with each other at all. Michaela's halfway through that exercise, which we also did last year, and we will do a blog on it as soon as we have it. But reading the Foreign Affairs Council's conclusions this morning, here's an interesting thing. I discovered at least 8 or 10 topics that were discussed by the Foreign Affairs Council which weren't in this package at all. So there's a whole thing on gender, including an action plan on gender, not in the package. There's a long section of this council conclusions on child labour, which isn't in there at all. And buried in that is a whole section on business and development and corporate social responsibility and announcement of new initiatives, and, by the way, trade policy, all sort of stuck in under child labour, but actually quite high level and strategic. Oh, look, there's a separate document, which is our priorities for the UN General Assembly, including peace and security, but also environment and sustainable development. There's a new EU strategy for Central Asia, developing countries. There's a whole section on the arms trade, top development topic. Cathy Ashton has produced the first of her annual reports on the CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy, document 10660/10. I haven't read it, can't find it, but I will. And it's all about development and threats and challenges and opportunities for the EU in the world. And finally, there's another document, document 1034/810, if you're interested, which is on the cross-country division of labour, which is part of the aid effectiveness agenda, but is somehow separate from this. So here are we, the Kremlinologists, sitting here with our kind of thick spectacles, and I feel like something out of a Smiley novel, out of MI6, trying to understand how all this fits together and where the leadership is and what are the priorities among all of this. And one thing I would say to Sven is that you in the Commission could make this a lot easier for us if you had one piece of paper where all this was noted. And one of the points that we made in the blog when the spring package came out was that last year's spring package has disappeared without trace and is never referred to again. And so actually if you say, oh, you had a really good spring package last year, what did you do about vulnerability flex in response to the financial crisis? Well, luckily Sven is here, so he knows the answer because he wrote it and dealt with it. But if he wasn't here, we'd have no idea at all because it's not mentioned. So dealing with the Commission and with European development policy is extraordinarily difficult, far more difficult than it needs to be, incredibly incoherent, and I think the Parliament needs to do something to pull that up. Now, I've got a couple of things on a PowerPoint. Deborah, do you know where they are?
It should be one on your screen.
This one? This is what's in the spring package. What do we think of all this? Well, there's been quite a discussion about it, and there are some big things that we expected, we hoped would be picked up and that weren't there, including, for example, legislating for 0.7 and being a little bit tougher on the aid side. And we said all that in our blog and we'll say more in due course. I think they're doing the best they can under rather difficult circumstances with a lot of member states not doing very well on development and with new governments in countries like the UK. But there is a long way to go. We've identified a number of milestones coming up over the course of the next 6 months. I think somebody already mentioned the EU-Africa summit. We've got our eye on the G20, of course, and there is a brand new ODI package on the G20 coming out, Dirk, any minute? Tomorrow. And a very interesting thing for me is that here we are recovering from the financial crisis, dealing with all these issues like global imbalances, currency crises, finding ways to manage fiscal stabilization, dealing with the problems of very unbalanced growth in the world. None of that appears somehow. That's somebody else's problem in the Commission. I think that's a huge error. I want to see Andris Piebalgs dominating the G20 agenda from a development perspective and not abdicating and leaving that, which I'm sure he doesn't want to do, to other commissioners who are more specifically concerned with finance or trade. Ditto climate. Climate is hardly mentioned here, really, although you talked a bit about it, Sven, but we have just had the Bonn meetings. We're building up to the huge Cancun COP at the end of November, early December, where we absolutely have to make progress on the global deal and on the financing of the global deal, which is, again, a crucial development issue. Now, Andris Piebalgs has listed a number of things that he's going to be doing in 2010, and there are some very important topics on here which we should now be focusing on in our analysis and policy advocacy over the next months. There's going to be a joint communication on climate change with Connie Hedegaard, who is the Climate Change Commissioner, which is going to come out in October. I actually, when Connie Hedegaard was here speaking at the Barbara Ward lecture for AIED, I said to her, you need to colonise the EAS and actually also colonise DG Development and vice versa. This is going to be a fascinating exercise. Do we have a coherent story about climate? Now, our big fear on the finance side, by the way, is that aid money will simply be siphoned off to meet climate commitments. Gordon Brown made a very good speech last year on climate in which he said that not more than 10% of the aid programme should be used for climate funding. That should be a European commitment. It wasn't, unfortunately, in the spring package. There's going to be two very interesting geographical communications later on this year, one on the Horn and one on Afghanistan. Now, when we did the white paper last year, when the government did the white paper, and I had a very small part in just part of it, one of the key things, and this is really important, was to have a whole of government joined up approach to development problems, where you bring together not just trade policy and finance, but also foreign policy and work together on places. And I always used the European Commission's geographical strategies as an example of what the UK ought to do. So I'm nearly finished, it's okay. So we should look at that. There's going to be a green paper, whatever that is, on budget support. Lots of angst about budget support. The Commission has been one of the great champions. Will they now be forced to give way by the Member States? There's going to be something on business in developing countries, which we're hoping to contribute to. There's going to be a lot of work on humanitarian assistance, which is, of course, outside Andris Piebalg's remit, but belongs to the Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs and Crisis, Georgieva. Thank you. And there's going to be work on a new financing instrument and a review of the overall policy framework. And then, this is the last thing I want to say, really, that Andris Piebalg has also done something very important, which is commit himself to a review of the European Consensus on Development. Now, the European Consensus on Development was a document agreed in 2005, which all member states and the Parliament and the Council and the Commission all signed up to, and it sets a framework for development cooperation. And it is pretty good, but it's a little bit dated, and this is a really good opportunity to tell the story about the future of development. And that story has some very important elements in it. I will not deal with those in detail, but we have in the document that we produced as a group of European think tanks back in February. A lot of it's in this ODI G20 document. Asia's booming. I've just come back from Asia. There isn't a country growing at less than 8%. 60% of the world's poor now live in middle-income countries. There are only 150 million poor people living in low-income countries. What does that mean for the future of development policy? Of course, a great chunk of the poor live in fragile states where aid on its own is not enough and where you need a completely different approach. Managing global public goods. The future development agenda is about how we manage financial crises and food crises and oil crises and everything else crises and climate change crises and security crises and global drugs and crime and terror and disease threats. That's a different kind of development program. So when Andris Piebalgs comes back next year with the revised consensus, what I hope and what I believe is he'll be telling us that the MDGs were a fantastically valuable framework for 10 years and they need to be part of our story in the future, but they're not enough. We need a new development story and a new development approach. And in the work we're doing on Europe, this is the absolutely last thing I'll say, the point we want to make is that the future of development cooperation has to be multilateral, because the problems we're dealing with are global problems, they require global solutions, they require international collective action. We can't do those as the UK, we can do them as Europe, and that's why it's so important that we don't just think about the money, but we think about the potential for working with these other 26 countries and with the institutions in Brussels, because that's how we're going to make the kind of world we want to see.
Thank you very much, Simon.